Today's daf, we're going to be learning a Shevuot Daf Zion. We're going to mainly deal with one big topic today. We'll get something else at the end of daf, but the first topic is the topic we started in the previous daf, which is how do you know that the psukim that talk about bringing the korban olevi yoreh, the sliding scale offering, where it specifically says in the psukim, you're impure and don't get rid of your impurity, and then you do a sin. What sin is that? To which we already know the sin is tumat mikdash v'kodashah, right? You went to the temple, or you ate sacrificial items. Now, how do we know that's what it is? That's the big question. So we're going to have 4 different attempts to answer this question. The first answer we already started, which is we said, those two are similar in that you get karet for them, and therefore the sacrifice is going to be a sin offering. To which the Gemara said, but maybe it's truma. To which they said, no, truma only has death, not karet, and that's much less severe. But then the Gemara says, wait, karet is usually with a chata, with a set sin offering, which is not a sliding scale, which is obviously more stringent because you can't just lower what you're bringing just because you can't afford it. And therefore, maybe you would say that when it comes to the regular death penalty, so there's no chatat sin offering for that, but maybe there is a sliding scale offering. And that's what we ended off, to which the Gemara says, right? And then they even prove it further. And that's the last thing. It's the beginning part of the daf. So it's the last thing we did yesterday. Let's start there. Olav yored nete. Maybe you would have to bring an olav yored on truma. Midi dehava shmiya kol v'abitoy sfatayim. Just like the other 2 examples are not karet examples. The other 2 things that you bring a sliding scale offering for aren't associated with karet at all, right? Whether you withhold testimony and you swear falsely, right? You swear you're going to do something and you don't do it. So since those aren't associated with karet, maybe this one isn't either. And we're back to square one. Maybe it's truma. To which they say, and we're still within the first explanation. The first explanation is what distinguishes these 2 from truma, karet. So now the Gemara says, Amar kra ba. Wait, look at the pasuk. Isha, oki ga. B'tumat adam l'chol tumato asher yitma ba. For any impurity that he becomes impurified with it. That's always a limiting word. Ba is a limiting word. What does ba come to do? Ba l'miute truma must come to exclude truma. What else? Then what do you mean, what else? Maybe, let's take the logic we've been using, that the olav yored is not as severe as the sin offering. Sin offering is kavua, it's set. Well, ema ba l'miute mikdash, delo sagele bekorban olav yored, adamaite korban kavua. Maybe it's actually coming to exclude mikdash. Going into the temple, if we think about the hierarchy, there's eating truma, up a level is eating sacrificial meat. In fact, even in laws of Tum and Tara, if you remember, there's Rishon, Sheni, Shlishi, Revi'i. There's Shlishi for Truma, and it even goes as far as Revi'i, a 4th degree for Kodshim. So they're clearly one level up from Truma. But one level up from that is going into the temple, right? Could you imagine going into the temple impure? That's even worse than all the others. So maybe we'll get rid of the other extreme. Instead of getting rid of the weaker one, let's get rid of the more severe one and say maybe a sliding scale offering isn't even enough. Maybe you need something more than that. So that's the Gemara's suggestion. In other words, basically saying, but doesn't help us. Because but could limit the mikdash instead. Okay, so that didn't work. So now, kari ale, now we get introduced to the next answer. So that was answer 1, kari. Because they're kari, that's why they get it. And the ba excludes anything else, but we saw that doesn't necessarily work. Kari Rava ale de Rebbe, dolet mayim miborot amukim. So Rebbe said about Rebbe, wow, he brings up water from deep, deep wells, meaning he came up with a great answer to this question. So, Tanya, where do we see Rebbe giving an answer? In a Braita. Rebbe Omer, Eka ani chaya, chaya, behema lama ne'emara. So the pasuk in the psukim here in our chapter, it says, O nefesh kitiga. Okay, we're in pasuk bet of this chapter. Nefesh kitiga b'chol davar tamei, o b'nivlat chayat mea. So you touch anything that's tamei, or the dead body of a chaya, o b'nivlat behemat mea, or the dead body of, right, either a non-kosher chaya or a non-kosher behemat. Now chaya and behemat are a little different. Right? Chaya is a wild animal, undomesticated animal. A behemat is a domesticated animal. But they're not much different in terms of laws of impurity or not. So why did it need to mention both? Once it said chaya, could have just said chaya. So behemat is unnecessary. Since it's unnecessary, we're going to make a gzera shava. To what? Well, let's see. Lama ne'emar? Ne'emar kan behemat me'ah, v'ne'emar lahalan behemat me'ah. Okay, what's this pasuk? This pasuk, we're skipping down to Vayikra Zayin, pasuk kaf aleph, and we're going to read these pasukim later also. Nefesh ki tiga b'kol tameh b'tumat adam. So you touch any sort of tameh, o b'behema, or with an animal tme'ah, non-kosher animal, o b'chol sheretz, ve'achal mi b'sar zevach hashlamim. This is where you intentionally eat sacrificial meat from a shlamim, okay, which is a peace offering. That's the part that usually the owners get to eat a lot of the meat of, but you did it while you were impure to a behemat me'ah is one of the options. What do we say? Gzera shava. And then, by the way, you get karet in the pasuk. So they say, what does that prove? Behema, right? And it says here, ma lahalan tumat kodesh. Now, what's the tuma there? The impurity is you were impure and you ate sacrificial meat. So, therefore, avkan tumat kodesh. Also here, it's tumat kodesh. So now the Gemara says, okay, wait. Eshkechan tumat kodesh. Okay, so that helped us. So now Rava says what Rebbe said was great. But what's the problem? It only gives us half. It tells us it's tumat kodesh. Doesn't tell us it's tumat mikdash. And if we remember from the previous answer, we were left with this in between, which is, well, we don't know which way it goes. Maybe it goes less stringent. Let's say it's truma because it's only a sliding scale offering. Or maybe it's mikdash because that's more severe. And of course you need a korban, whereas truma maybe not. So we don't know which way to go. So how do we know which way to go because we know it's tumat mikdash, but how are we going to get there? So, and in the end, I'll just let you know that in the end, we're going to keep Rebbe for proving Kodesh, but we're not going to really be convinced about it, how we get from Kodesh to Mikdash, okay, from sacrificial items to the temple. Okay, so now they're going to say, even though it seems convincing at first, Eshkachan Tumat Kodesh, Tumat Mikdash Minalan. So where are we going to get Tumat Mikdash? Amar Kra, the pasuk says, Bechol Kodesh lo tiga, ve'ela Mikdash lo tavo. This is by the woman who's a yoledet. And what happens after you give birth? You have to wait all those days, the impure blood days, then the pure blood days. And then after that, you bring a sacrifice. And until that point, you bring a sacrifice. Bechol kodesh lo tiga. She cannot touch anything kodesh, which is kodshim, right? Sacrificial meat. And el mikdash lo tavo. And she can't come into the mikdash. By the way, it's not just sacrificial meat. It could be meal offerings. And el mikdash lo tavo. Look what's juxtaposed in the pasuk. Eat kash mikdash the kodesh, and therefore whatever's true for kodesh is going to be true for mikdash, and that is a great answer. Except you already know it's not because I told you it's not. What's the problem? Mihachi trumanami. You remember we learned this in Makod and Daf Yudalid. Da'amar mar b'chol kodesh lo tigal rabotat truma. Some people understood that pasuk is referring actually to truma, not to sacrificial meat, which means that you can't learn it there. So, or you could say this includes truma as well. So we're back to square one where we don't know whether it's mikdash or truma. So they say, no, it's obviously not truma because hamir rahman ba, right? Because remember, we have the ba, which comes to excludes truma, but we already know it doesn't necessarily exclude truma. It could exclude mikdash. Aim ba the move to mikdash, right? It could, for all intents and purposes, get rid of mikdash and keep truma in. So they say no. Mistabra mikdash lo mema'atinan shekem b'karet k'motah. But again, where did we start today? That Mikdash and Kodesh are similar because they both get karet. And that's why it would make a lot more sense to exclude Truma if we're going to exclude something. To which the Gemara says, what do you mean? Adraba, Truma lo mematinan sheken achilak motah. You could say, I'm not going to exclude Truma because Truma and Kodesh are both eating something, whereas the Mikdash is going into a place. That's a totally different thing. You're going to put two together. I'd rather put two things that are a sin, a transgression of eating, rather than one that's eating and one that's going into the temple. So it could go either way, in which case, again, Rebbe has done a good job of proving Achila Kodesh, but we don't know which direction it goes in, which other case is going to be the one included and which is the one excluded. And that is, again, we do know, but it can't be proven from here because our proof falls short. Okay, third attempt. Ella Amarava, okay, I'll just review. First attempt was to say the two with karet, because they have karet goes with korban, right? But then we said not necessarily, because this is a lighter korban, and maybe that doesn't prove it. Then we said, okay, we have this gzera shava behema tmea. Because it says behema there. Our pasuk is behema. We don't know what it means. We learned from a pasuk where it talks about eating kodshim. So that teaches kachim, but we weren't able to get from there to truma or mikdash, but we didn't know, it wasn't able to prove one over the other, so we can't figure that. So Amarav, shalosh kritu b'shlam. There's 3 psukim that talk about karet in eating sacrificial meat. Okay, one was that pasuk kaf aleph that we saw. One is actually pasuk kaf in that same chapter. We're in Vayikra chapter 7, verses 20 and 21. They're very, very similar. They both talk about eating sacrificial meat while you're impure. And then there's another pasuk, which is in chapter 22, verse 3, which is Kol Isha Sheyikrab Mikol Zarachem Ala Kodeshim. You come close to Kodeshim with Tumato Alav V'Nichrita. All 3 psukim talk about eating sacrificial meat while you're, or coming close to sacrificial meat, while you're impure and karet. So there's 3 psukim all about karet. Seems very repetitive. How do we learn this? So what do we do with the 3? Rava says, Echat leklal ve'echat leprat. So first of all, we're going to darshan a klal and prat here. Klal and prat means, right, we have a general, which is, right, generally you're going to have one of these is you eat anything that's tameh, but then you have a prat. Now the prat is, you, right, any sacrificial item, it sounds like, right, or any kodshim. Then it says, in another one of the references, it says shlamim specifically, right? That's what we saw. You eat zevach shlamim. So what does it come to teach you? Only things that are like a korban shlamim. Okay, later we'll see some things that might be excluded because they're not like a korban shlamim. And echad, what's the third? The third must come to prove our point. What's that? Echad lidvarim she'einam nechalim, right? If you remember, I just want to review. Klal and prat means you have this general, but then once you have the detail, the general rule is only going to apply to things that are similar to a korban shlamim. Okay? Which basically is going to mean, I'll already tell you, what it means is it's sacrificial meat or sacrificial item, something that was offered in the temple, but not something that was, let's say, sanctified because somebody said, I want to give my couch to the temple, okay? And you haven't redeemed it yet. And let's say an impure person touches that, that's not a problem. It has to be something that goes on the altar, that's something like that. Okay. So what's the third one? The chad, sorry, skip down because it says it again. Okay. The third one is to tell us, oh, you know, there's that place in the Torah that we don't know what it is, where there's Tumah mentioned in the Torah somewhere else. This third verse, remember, 2 are in Vayikra Zayin, 1 is in Vayikra Kaf Bet. One of them is coming to teach you, it's fully unnecessary, it's coming to teach you, oh, this can teach us about that one place of impurity that we don't know what it is in the Korban Levi Yored in chapter 5. Okay, what's it going to teach us? Well, what kind of tumah is it talking about here? What do you do when you're impure? You ate sacrificial meat. So, Heve Omer, Tumat Kodesh. But what's the problem? That's not our question. We already have a source for Tumat Kodesh. So what do they say? Imenoin the Tumat Kodesh. Not denafka lemi de Rebbe. We already learned it from Rebbe Tumat Kodesh. So a classic imenoin lezet, Tanei lezet. Let's teach something else. What are we going to teach? Something like it. Tanei the Tumat Mikdash. Okay, so let's learn from there. Now the Gemara could have asked, why don't you learn it to Truma? Okay, but they don't ask because they have other problems, other questions, or other difficulties. What's the difficulty? The difficulty is going to be that this third one is used by Rabbi Avau for a different drasha. Okay, so they're going to say the following: you need it. Rabbi Avau. We need that third one for a different drasha. Rabbi Avau says, Shalosh kretu b'shlamim lama. Why do you have 3 places where it says karet for being impure and eating korban shlamim? Echat leklav, echat leprat. As we said, to teach you, there's only a problem if it's something like korban shlamim. Ve'echat ledvarim she'einam nechalim. And one is to tell you, what if it's things that went on the altar or go on the altar that was sanctified to go on the altar, like wood, frankincense, incense that you eat. Now, they're not meant for eating, but if you eat them when you're impure, just like if you eat sacrificial meat when you're impure, you'll get karet. Also, you'll get karet for these. So it's needed for some other drasha. Now, that's only according to some. Le Rabbi Shimon, we're going to have 2 tracks within this. Le Rabbi Shimon, mishum tuma. So what's it coming to teach according to Rabbi Shimon? Rabbi Shimon says you don't get karet for things that aren't eaten if you eat them, because that's not the normal way to two things. So if I'm impure and I eat wood that was for the altar, sanctified for the altar, I don't get karet for that. So then I don't need Rabbi Abba's drasha. I could go back to Rabbi's drasha and I could explain. But even according to Rabbi Shimon, it's for something else. La Tuyet, that third mention of it is to teach you chataot pnimiyot. Even now, what did we say? It has to be like the korban shlamim. Now, the chataot pnimiyot, or the korban of chatat, like the one you do on Yom Kippur, where the blood is sprinkled inside, or the par from Yom, right? There's the seir and the par on Yom Kippur. There's the par helim davar shel tzibur, the par kohen HaMashiach, which when this whole nation sins, when the kohen gadol doesn't sin by accident. Those all are done inside in the Kodesh Kodeshim. They're not on the inner altar, but you don't deal with them on right in the Hechal. Some of them are in the Hechal, some are in the Kodesh Kodeshim. The point is, you don't; those are different, and they're not really like a shlamim. So because they're not brought on the same altar. Now, the Salkadat Achamina who ilva Amar Rabbi Shimon kol she'eno karev mizbeach hachitzon kishlamim ein chayavim alav mishum pigul. Now, you might have thought that since Rabbi Shimon himself, because remember, we're within Rabbi Shimon now, and Rabbi Shimon himself says that anything that's on the Mizbach HaChitzon, like Shlamim, that's any korban that's brought on the outer altar, which is just like Shlamim, Ein Chayavim, sorry, I had to read it wrong. Kol she'eno karev like a Shlamim. If it's not brought on the outer altar, like the Shlamim, then Ein Chayavim alav mishum pigul. Pigul is one big thing we're going to get to when we get to Zvachim. But pigul is basically, it's where you have the wrong intent at one of the stages of bringing the sacrifice. You have intent to bring it in the wrong time, do some action in the wrong time, whatever it is. Okay, eat in the wrong time. We'll get to all that later, or in the wrong place. There is no pigul for any of the sacrifices that aren't brought just like the shlamim. It's the pasuk of pigul is relating to a shlamim. It has to be like a shlamim, which excludes the chataot pnimiyot. Since they're excluded from there, you might have thought they're excluded from our topic as well, right? You might have thought also that you're not chayav karet if you're doing it intentionally. If I'm impure and I eat the meat of, or I touch the meat of a chatat apnimit, you might have thought I won't be liable, because just like I'm not liable pigul, I'm not liable for that, especially since the whole context was a korban shlamim. Kamash malan demechayev. So according to this, we have two tracks of what we can learn from this third mention. Either Rabbi Avow, that we're going to learn the things that aren't eaten, you're still going to be liable for, or you're going to learn, for Rabbi Shimon, who doesn't think that, you're going to learn that this includes the chataot pnimiyah. So either which way this pasuk is used, and Rabbi can't use it to teach, this was all intentional. We wanted it to teach us about the unwitting and the korban olev yoreh. We can't do it. So now they say, fine. Now we have a different version of Rava. In Nahardia, they said, Ela Amri Nahardia, Mishmei de Rava, it's not shalosh kritud, and the whole karet thing that we learned, because the karet really is used for other drashot, either Rabbi Avow or Rabbi Shimon. But the shalosh tuma b'shlamim lama. In those same three psukim, it talks in all those psukim about impurity. It talks about karet, it talks about impurity. Now, of course, it's the impurity that causes the karet. But the point is, before we thought we were darshaning the third mention of karet, now we're going to darshan the third mention of the tuma here. That's unnecessary. So now again, why does it say it three times? Echad leklal, echad leprat, right? One is for the klal uprat, just like before, that it has to be like shlamim. Let's explain that the third mention of tuma in that third pasuk, again, in the two in Vayikra Zayin, Kaf Aleph, and the one in Vayikra chapter 22, verse, I forget now what verse it is, just remember, verse 3, okay? Chapter 22, verse 3, also has three mentions of tuma, impurity. So let's say that it's that third mention of impurity, and that's what does it. So they say, and that's what teaches you about this case in our pasuk, in Vayikra, where we don't know what tuma, it must be that one. Right? It must be again. Then we do the same thing as Rabbi did previously, because this is just a different version of Rabbi. Right? Omer Tuma Kodesh should be Tuma Kodesh, because that's the context of this pasuk. However, it may know on the Tuma Kodesh, but we don't need it for that, because Rabbi already taught us Denafka mi de Rebbe, we learned it from Rebbe. Today when Yam Tuma Mikdash. Okay, so let's teach it to Mikdash. But that's not going to work either because kind of obvious. Hainami mibayele. We obviously need those 3 tumas in the pasuk. Why? Well, if you need the 3 kritut, then you obviously need the 3 tumas because I did buy the mixed karet l'chidrabi aval hatavnami tumot. In other words, you can't get to karet if you didn't have the impurity before. So once you say the karet is necessary, obviously the impurity is needed to serve the karet. Without the impurity, you wouldn't get karet. So you can't say that's another thing we can darshan in the pasuk. Okay, so that didn't work, right? It wouldn't make sense without saying tuma in those 3 psukim. So attempt number 3 didn't work. Okay, let's just review again because it'll help us keep the stop in order. Attempt number 1, the Tuma Mikdash and Kodesh and eating Kodesh are karet versus Truma, which is mita b'dei shamayim. And generally we associate korbanot chatat with karet transgressions. But since this is an olav yored and it's not a regular chatat, maybe actually it would be Truma and it wouldn't be Mikdash, so that didn't help us. Then we have Rebbe. Rebbe gave us a really good proof for Kodesh because he said the behema, I'm really good, but it's Gzera Shava. Behema, we're going to learn from the behema in our pasuk from a behema in a different pasuk, where there the context is the one we've been talking about also in the 3rd answer, which is all about eating sacrificial meat intentionally when you're impure. Same topic. We're going to say, that's eating sacrificial meat. This is eating sacrificial meat. And then we tried to say, how do we get to Mikdash? The juxtaposition. The problem is that Kol Kodesh Lo Tigah could also be Truma, so that doesn't help us. And in both cases, by the way, we tried to use the word ba to limit, but that didn't help either because ba could limit one or the other, and we didn't know which one. The 3rd was the 3 kritut, and the 3rd karet there in the intentional sins is unnecessary, must be to shed light on this pasuk that we don't know what it is. What's the problem? The problem is that that's needed for either Rabbi Abau's drasha or Rabbi Shimon's drasha, and it's not free. And if you try to say the word tuma in the pasuk is free, it's also not free because without the tuma, you're not going to get karet, so that didn't work. 4th answer. Ela amarav. Atya tumato tumato. Now let's see what pasukim we're going to quote here. Tivhacha lechol tumato. Okay, this is in our pasuk. That's Vayikra, verse 3 in chapter 5. Uchtiv hatam in para aduma. Okay, tamei yeh od tumato bo. And there in the pasuk it says, "Et Mishkan Hashem Timei." He defiled the dwelling, the sanctuary of God. Okay, the tabernacle of God. That is the mikdash. So there, the tuma, there's a disqualification of the mikdash going and disqualifying the temple. Therefore, the tuma by us is also temple. So mala halan tuma mikdash afkan tuma mikdash. That works very nicely. What's the problem though? It is an interesting problem. We had this ba before. We talked about the word ba in the pasuk, which comes to limit. Now, the issue is going to be that if the word ba is limiting something, it means we need it to limit something. But right now, we don't need it to limit anything because we've just proven from the pasuk itself that it's mikdash. We proved already before that it's kodesh, kodshim. So we don't need to limit anything. We don't need a pasuk to limit the truma. So ela ba lama li. So what do we need the ba for? To which the Gemara answers, it's actually not really, and I'll tell this to you outside first. And by the way, I didn't say we're at the top of Amud Bet. The ba right now is not coming to limit something. It's coming to include something. Okay? And it's not, which we're going to question, because what do you mean? Until now, we've been saying it's limiting. And the other thing we're going to do here is it's not coming to limit which cases of what you did when you were impure. It's going to, but forget limit or include. But the topic is not going to be what you did when you were impure, which we thought it related to because that was the part that was missing in the pasuk. It's what you became impure to. And it's going to include an additional case that you might not have thought was included. What is that? L'rabot nevelat of tahol. If you became impure to a kosher bird, we'll talk about that in a minute, why it's different. You might have thought that wouldn't be impurity, that you'd have to bring this korban olev yored if you then went into the temple or, forgot and then ended up in the temple or eating sacrificial meat and then remembered. You might have thought it was excluded. This word ba comes to include it. So we have a few questions. Why is this different than anything else? And why is ba all of a sudden including instead of excluding? So nevelat of tahor is a very strange kind of tuma. It's not, you don't become impure by touching it. You become impure by eating it while it's in your mouth. If you touch something or you like you're tamei at the time it's in your mouth. Okay, it's called tuma beit habliya. It's while it's in your mouth and you're swallowing it, you impart tuma at that point. Okay, impurity. So ha'amaret ba'mi'utahu mishum demi'utahu iyatir. So now they say, wait a minute. How could you possibly say that this is what ba is coming to do? Right? We already said, right? Ha'amaret ba mi'utehu. Ba, we said, is always to exclude, not to include more things. It means this and not anything else. So now they say, I read a little too far, right? It's just first the words ha'amaret ba mi'utehu. Didn't you say that? So they say, mishum de mi'utehu iyater. Now, what does this mean? You have to read on a little bit more, okay? But because it's extra, because it excludes, it basically becomes unnecessary. So let's explain what this means. Ktiv o kiyiga, okay, it says if you touch tumata adam, bar negia in de la bar negia lo. It was already excluded from the beginning because it said only things that you touch, which means not something that imparts tuma, not by touching it, but by eating it, which would exclude the of tahor, right? So de la bar negia lo, if it's not touch something that you would normally touch, right? It doesn't pass on impurity through touching, no. But then uchtiv ba, then it says ba again, which is again to exclude the off-tahor, but we already excluded the nevela. By word, we're talking about if you come in contact with a dead off-tahor, right? And not a bird died on its own, carries impurity, okay? If it's kosher bird, but only if it's in your mouth. Now, uktiv ba miuta, uktiv ba, sorry. Okay, God, habi miut achar miut, ve'em miut achar miut, ela l'rabot. We've seen this before. You have two exclusions, like a double negative, it becomes a positive. So two things that exclude, one ki'iga, and then ba, both exclude the nevelat of tahor. Now we're going to say, it's included because two exclusions make an inclusion. And from there, we did it. We finally came up with an answer, the fourth answer, which is to write the tumato bo, the tumato, right? Tumato bo of para aduma. We're going to learn it from there. Mishkan Hashem timei. That's the issue. We just had a side question about but we resolved it. It's coming for something else entirely. Now we're going to go on to the next part of the Mishnah. Yesh b'yediah b'tchila ve'ein b'yediah b'sof. If you knew about it in the beginning, but then you forgot, and then you still forgot. So what provides this person with atonement until such time that they figure out their sin? Se'ir hanasa b'fnim. On Yom Kippur, the se'ir that's brought in, blood is brought into the Kodesh Kodeshim. That's the one. So how are we going to learn this out? So the Gemara is going to bring a bright to the Darshans list. Tanu Rabbanit, v'chiper ala kodesh mitumot b'nei Israel. Okay, this is the pasuk describing. This is in the upcoming parsha in Achremot, which is right. V'chiper. I'm going to read what this sacrifice does. The se'ir nasa b'fnim. Kiper ala kodesh. It atones for sanctity. Mitumot b'nei Israel, from the tumah, the impurity of the Jewish people. Umi pishehem, and from their sins. L'chol chatotam, for all their sins, transgressions. Okay, etc. So now they say, what is this mitumot b'nei Israel? Yesh libinyan zel avi shalosh tumot. Now you would have assumed that what's this sacrifice, this big sacrifice on Yom Kippur? You wouldn't have really thought tumah kodesh u'mikdashav, right? Tumah mikdash v'kodeshav. You would have thought sins that the people do, especially pisheim, chateim, all sorts of bad sins. Sins that are mentioned in the Torah in the context of impurity. Okay, even though they're not really related to impurity, Torah uses the language of impurity by them. What are those? The three biggies. What are the three biggies? The same ones as Yareg Ba'al Yavor. Okay? Tumat, you would have thought, Yesh Libinyan Zel Lavi Shalosh Tumot. I would have thought three. What three? Okay, why they got to three? Well, just because these are the big three. Tumat Avodah Zarah, okay, idol worship. Tumat Giloi Arayot, coming impure by inappropriate relations. V'tumat Shvichut Damim, and murder. How do we know these are all associated with impurity? We're going to quote you a pasuk by each of them. B'avodah zarah hu omer, by idol worship, it says leman tameh mikdashi, because you disqualify my temples by worshiping avodah zarah. B'giloi arayot hu omer shmartem et mishmarti lebilti asom mechukot hatoevot ha'ela, and then it says v'lo titamu b'hem, and don't become impurified by engaging in all these sexual relations with forbidden women. B'shvichut, and obviously men, it goes in both directions. By death, by murder, it says, below titamet haaretz, right? If we don't get rid of murderers, it's going to defile the land. So there also the word tumah. So I would have thought that was what I would have assumed this big sacrifice at Yom Kippur is atoning for. Makes a lot of sense. Talmud Lamal, but wait, the pasuk says mi tumot b'nei Israel. Below kol tumot. Every time we have mi, it means some, not all. If it was all, I would say this covers all. These three are kind of the three big ones. But because it says some of, it's only some. It's not all. So now, how do we get to what the some is? So now they say mamatzinu shechilei kakatuv michlal kol tumot. Okay, we see now, this you're going to have to wait for tomorrow's daf to understand this, but there's a place where Tumat Mikdash v'Kodashav is distinguished, different from all the others. Okay, perhaps it's because there's this Korban Olevi Yored specifically for it. Okay, but it stands out somehow from all the others. But tomorrow we'll try to figure out what this means later. So since there's a place where this is singled out among all other Tumat, Avkan, we'll say the same thing here, Tumat Mikdash v'Kodashav. Divrei Rabbi Yehuda. That's how Rabbi Yehuda gets to it from this mitumot. And that's what we know is this time about Tumat Mikdash v'Kodashav, right? Which again, but it would be what you knew about it, but you still don't know about it. Rabbi Shimon Omer says, I have a much better proof. Mim komo muchla. From the pasuk itself, you can see it very clearly, and maybe you noticed it when I read it. Harehu Omer v'chiper al hakodesh. It says, and it atones for kodesh. What is kodesh if not eating sacrificial items when you're impure or going into the temple when you're impure? Right? Mitumot shel kodesh. Okay, so it's the limit to tumot that are related with kodesh. Now, you might have thought, okay, so if you say this atones for mikdash and kodesh and all that, well, yachola kol tumash b'chodesh yeseiru zeh mechaper. Maybe it atones for you knew about it, you forgot, and then you found out, and maybe it still atones for you. Well, Talmud lamar mi pishehem lechol chatatam. Well, we're going to have to compare it to these words, pshaim and chataim. Now, Chata'im dumia de psha'im. The sins that we're getting atonement for have to be like psha'im. Psha'im are when you do things intentionally. And when you do things intentionally, you can't just bring a korban and say, oh, I'll atone for this by bringing a sacrifice. So, ma psha'im she'inam b'nei korban, most intentional sins, right? Usually you bring a sin offering because you forgot, you made a mistake. But sin offerings, right? So psha'im don't get to bring sacrifices. Av chata'im she'inam b'nei korban. So this can only be things that we don't have a sacrifice to atone for. Now, if we say that this includes a person who knew, forgot, went into the temple, and then realized their mistake, they bring a korban olevi yored. The one in Yom Kippur is not going to atone for something that already has a sacrifice atoning for it and doesn't need a korban, right? Once you have a korban already, this isn't it. Okay? Uminayin now. Still, what could it be? Maybe it could be the reverse. Maybe you never knew you were impure, and then you find out later that you were impure and went into the temple. Right? Why is it specifically there was yediyah and then there isn't later? So, how do you know it's that specific one? That this seir basically keeps you, what's the word? It tied you over until such time that you figure out. If you remember later that you were impure originally and then went into the temple, then you have to bring your own individual sin offering. This one just provides you with atonement in the interim. Talmud Lamal, how do you know it's that one? Lechol chatatam. Now, what does that mean? Chayaveh chataot b'mashma. Because it says lechol chatatam, it means people who could theoretically bring a sin offering down the road. In other words, this is a tide me over one. And if you never knew about it from the beginning, you can't ever bring an individual sin offering, right? That's not one of the things the sin offering is for. You had to have yediyah from the beginning. We already darshan that. So it would have to be something that could eventually lead to you bringing your own sin offering, and therefore there has to be yediyah in the beginning, and it's just that you don't know about it now. Otherwise, you wouldn't be bringing this one. You'd be bringing the korban olevi yored. Okay. We'll end with this last Amar Mar. Now we're going to start going back into this Braita. We just finished the Braita proving what we were looking for, which is how do we know the seir on Yom Kippurim that's done inside atones for these kind of mistakes, right? Where you knew about it, forgot, and still haven't figured it out. So we learned why it's not Gilurayot Shvichutabim and all that. So now we're going to go back. Amar Mar. Now we're going to go through the three of them. We're only going to start with the first one for today. What's the case of Avodah Zarah? Even mazid, if you did it intentionally, you're supposed to get the death penalty. It's obviously not that the seir on Yom Kippurim is going to atone for people who did avodah zarah intentionally. Ibishogeg, if it's accidental, bar korbanhu, you think you can bring a sacrifice? You shouldn't be able to bring a sacrifice to atone for avodah zarah bishkaga. Okay, that doesn't. You're not going to be able to bring the sacrifice for that. Second. Oh, sorry. Yeah, I said it wrong. It is bar korban, but not this korban. In other words, again, we have a korban for that. What's that? And so I knew something wasn't sounding right that I was saying. We have a special, there's actually a special chatat sin offering mentioned in Bamidbar, I believe, chapter 15, for someone who accidentally worships idols, didn't realize they bring a special sin offering. So the one on Yom Kippur is not going to atone for that. We already have a sin offering. So what could it possibly be? Well, one of two possibilities. That we'll finish for today. B'mezid below atrube, you did intentionally, but there was no warning. So this is going to provide you with some atonement for that. Or b'shogeg below it yadele, or it was b'shogeg, but you didn't even realize it. So kind of like, right, just like in the end, it's for the mikdash, the kodashah. What were they? This was all just saying, what were they thinking? Maybe they thought that maybe it would work if you didn't yet know that you worshiped avodah zarah. Okay, it was unintentional, and you still haven't figured your mistake. Maybe it will provide you with atonement in the interim. Of course, it doesn't, but that was just what they thought from the beginning. Okay, so that's today's daf. We can really summarize today's daf super succinctly. We can say that we're basically looking for two things. The first one was, how do you know that the pasuk, the korban levi yored, when we forget something when we're impure, what was the action, though, that we did, which was missing in the pasuk, that it's going into the temple or eating sacrificial meat? How do we know that? We brought four possibilities to explain, and it took us right till the last one, until we finally covered everything. And most of them were rejected or partially rejected. And then we got to this question of, how do you know that the sacrifice on Yom Kippur of the Shiur, or goat offering that's brought inside, is atoning for you did know, you forgot, and you still don't know? And how do you know it's not for, let's say, Gilorei Shpichutamim and Avodah Zarah? Okay, that's it for today. Wishing everyone a good day, and you should hear the Savat Tavot.